class. My name is Sergio Silva Jr. I'm going to be taking a stab at recording a video for option one of our week two's discussion board. So before I get into the main topics, one, I want to talk about the references that I will be using. So Robert Howland from 2010, the article that was posted in our additional resources, and that's the article evaluating the bioavailability and bioequivalence of generic medications. The second will be our textbook, and that's Sinicola et al. From 2020, Basic Psychopharmacology for Mental Health Professionals. Those are going to be the only two sources that I used for the entirety of this video. So I have the video structured in kind of just separated all of the main points that the option one asked to cover. And before I get into those specific points, just going to define a couple of really important terms that I really feel will help understand the explanation of all the different points involved. Bioavailability is the first one, and that is essentially the rate and the extent, so the speed or the amount really that an active ingredient gets absorbed, active ingredient of your main drug, of your main substance. And so how much of that does your biological system actually get by the time it reaches its final source, and how fast does that process happen? Bioequivalence is relevant here when we talk about generic drugs and brand name drugs, which we'll get a little more into there, but it's essentially comparing the bioavailability from one drug to the next of essentially the same kind of drugs, generic versus brand. And so the very first point is to discuss the role of absorption as a determinant of bioavailability. There are a multitude of different ways that a drug can be administered and absorbed biologically, the most common of which, according to Sinicola et al., is orally. But there are so many different types of ways. There's intramuscular, and that's just injecting straight into the muscle. There is subcutaneously, and that's deep tissue injection. There is nasal sprays. You see that with like allergy things, and there's dermal injection. There's an inhalational. You can see like albuterol, asthma medications, things like that. There is sublingual, pretty straightforward there, under the tongue. There's transdermally, anything just directly onto the skin. You can see that as different creams and medicinal creams and that sort of thing. And of course, there's IV, intravenously. And so all of these essentially go through different biological systems to reach its final endpoint, its goal, right, and the finish line. And depending on what biological systems and the substances in question, they will be metabolized and broken down or activated at a different rate and a different extent, hence the topic of, or the definition of bioavailability that we talked about earlier. So there's a term here, first pass effect, that this option asks to clarify a little bit, and that has to do with the liver. The liver, after the gut and everything, the liver is essentially the first organ, or one of the first main biological systems that a substance will pass through or get metabolized by. So you can have a high first pass metabolism, you can have a low first pass metabolism. And that's essentially how much of that active ingredient or how much of that substance is left over after it gets metabolized through that first pass metabolism through the liver. And this has everything to do with the composition of the drug and how you build that drug up, and what you put in there, and the dosage and all that sort of thing. It's of course infinitely more complex than I'm saying now, but for the sake of the context and for not making this video 10,000 hours, that's what we got there. Let's see here. The next one of the next points is clinical ramifications that a clinician may encounter when it comes specifically to bioavailability of generic medications. So the FDA does not require such rigorous processes of approval for generic versions of drugs They do apparently require, studies and, and a whole slew of processes to approve a brand name drug. Once that does get approved, a lot of that approval kind of gets merited, and then there is just a more simplified criterion that you would need to for the FDA to approve generic drugs. This particular part of the information is coming from um, Howland, Robert Howland from 2010, the article I mentioned earlier, and there are 7 of these criterion here. So it of course has to have the same active ingredients. It needs to be identical in strength, in terms of dosage. The administration route, like we talked about earlier, needs to be the same. So if it's an oral drug for the brand name, it needs to be oral as well for the generic. Their bioequivalence, the rate and the extent that it gets absorbed, that needs to be between 80 and 125% equivalent. The bioavailability, that is, needs to be between 80 and 125%. And it needs to have the same clinical indications, the same clinical uses, right? The same reasons for the drugs. And it needs to meet the same strength and purity and quality and all that, which is, a little arbitrary and vague. The 7th point is really kind of drives this arbitrary and vague point home. They need to be manufactured according to good manufacturing practice regulations, quote unquote, which, doesn't really land super comfortably with me. And I think that kind of leads into this point of what are some of the clinical considerations, right? They might not be as effective. They might not, generic drugs, that is, might not affect individuals the same as the brand name drugs. And this might be an issue with cost. Individuals who might not necessarily be able to afford brand name drugs, which are typically a little more expensive or a lot more expensive, might be stuck with generic drugs that didn't go through such rigorous testing that have a little more of a crapshoot going on there. And so let's see, that is kind of touched on that last point just now. Yeah, all right, that is everything for this quick little video. It's at least 5 minutes. It's about 8, so that's not too bad. I hope all of that made sense. I definitely learned a lot putting it into language, to more colloquial language to put into a video. So I jumped on this option when I saw it. All right.